All right. Happy Tuesday. Hopefully everybody's up and ready to go. I know we've already got obviously Monday under our belt and we're into the week. So hopefully everybody's doing well. And before we get started, we're waiting for people to jump on. Any wins or victories right now? Silence doesn't necessarily mean you haven't had wins or victories. Could just be utter shyness, right, Jeanette?
Maybe.
Man, it's just a beautiful day. So grateful to make it in.
All right. Well, it's going to be hot, that's for sure. The next couple of days, at least maybe 9 to 10 days, are going to be a little toasty. So hang in there. But that's all right. Okay. We're going to go ahead and just jump right in and pick up where we left off from last week. So for those of you that were on last week, if you remember, we jumped into the new construction REPC, and we were breaking that down. We kind of got about halfway through. We're going to touch back on, we're going to probably still revert back to some of the sections that we covered last week, because the parts that we're going to talk about today, they really kind of tie in together. And there's a lot of the paragraphs that we're going to talk about today, we might even just glance over, because it's the same paragraph that it exists in the REPC itself. And so there may not be as much of a need to jump into it, but we can certainly, if there's questions, we can talk about it. So let me go ahead and share my screen, and we will jump right in. All right, Jeanette, are you able to see the?
Yeah, I can see it.
Okay, good. Okay, we're going to jump right here out of the gate, and I think we ended on paragraph 8, and section 8. That's kind of your overall, as we mentioned, your get out of jail free card section, similar to the REPC. And so let's first jump right back into section 9. Section 9 really is dealing with the plans, the specifications, the things that you need to find out about the home that's being built. And it's broken up in 2 parts. 9.1 is specifically talking about the plans and the specifications that are being addressed. This is where the buyer selects the color, the finishes that are there. Maybe there are appliances they're going to be looking for, the cabinets, and everything that gives the buyer information about the house is what that, the plans and the specifications are supposed to occur. Then it takes us into this pre-construction meeting. And as I've highlighted, this meeting should, to go over the plans and specifications, that should be done prior to this deadline. So prior to the pre-construction meeting deadline, buyer and seller shall meet to review the plans and specifications in the plot, and then sign any change order. Many times what I'm seeing is, let's see here. If you go down to section 24, where it has all the dates. So we've got that pre-construction meeting deadline. That's one of the dates that end up being identified. And too many times I see the builders and the client and the agent, they're meeting the day of that deadline. And that's when they're having this, they're going over the plans, they're going over the specifications. And so, I mean, it's certainly possible to make that happen and do it then, but that would not be my recommendation. So just use that as a guideline that is going to show that this opportunity to sit down with the builder to go over the plans and specifications, this should be done, in my opinion, I think whatever amount of time you can get before that deadline, at least a week, I think maybe even 2 weeks, because oftentimes at these meetings, both the client and the builder have to go back and get some more information. They need to get some details about maybe different appliances that are being offered. They need to, or maybe there's different color choices that the client's looking at, and the builder's willing to look into it and see either A, can they get that color, and B, is there a cost increase to make that happen? So there's time that typically is needed before that pre-construction meeting. To go over these plans and specifications. So I would give yourself some time when you're doing that. Now, let's say that there are certain choices as we come down here in the second line, where it says, to the extent that a choice of color, grade, type, material after the pre-construction meeting, buyer shall notify seller in writing of such selections no later than either 10 days or blank days after receipt of seller's written request for such selections. So meaning the seller's needing to be notified of certain choices. And if those choices are not finalized after this pre-construction meeting deadline, well, then this is where you're going to put, the buyer is going to have X amount of days or 10 days after this pre-construction meeting to give those selections to the seller. And then if the buyer does not meet those or choose those selections within that time frame, then seller shall have the right to make the selections at their sole discretion. So be mindful of the fact that there's something that the buyer's got to do, and if they don't do it, then the seller, to avoid any other delays, the seller is going to have the right to go ahead and make those selections themselves. Okay. Let me know if there's any questions, or if that makes sense. Now, after this pre-construction meeting, that's when you're making all the selections, the plans, specifications. And then this is when change orders are typically going to be done if necessary. It says now no changes will be made to the plans or specifications except by written change order addendum signed in advance by the buyer and seller. And any change order addendum shall set forth the changes made, any adjustments in the purchase price, and any change in substantial completion deadlines. Payments made by buyer to seller for any change orders may only be used for construction of the residence. Buyer understands that any change orders requested by may affect the appraised value of the residence and the terms and conditions available in financing. So that part is important, because so many times we have our clients that have an idea what they want to have done, and they'll go to the builder, and the builder say, yeah, sure, we can do that. And more than likely the client is thinking, when, oh, we can do that, that it's not going to be any additional cost, that's just A, the cost of just the change order itself, but B, the cost of making delays, or the cost of just the material itself. There's 3-4 separate reasons that can increase that cost of doing this. And then in addition, a buyer may come in and say they want to make some changes, and that change in the residence may impact the appraised value for that home. And if that's the case, the buyer, the client, needs to be aware that, hey, these changes can impact the home's ability to appraise. And if that's the case, this is going to be on you, buyer, to make up the difference. So we got to make sure that the majority of the problems we have with our clients is a lack of understanding and communication, lack of stating expectations, and then also protecting yourselves when you do state expectations or have conversations that later down the road, when the problem comes up, somebody tries to claim that they were never made aware of anything, and they want to blame it on you or somebody else. And so make sure when you have these conversations that you've got the paper trail to support what changes have occurred, so that if there is a misunderstanding, you can go back and say, hold on a second, we talked about this and you perfectly understood and you were aware of it. That'll make things move much, much smoother. Okay. Any questions on that so far? Okay, seems pretty straightforward. Seller warranties. So this shouldn't be new information, but on new builds, sellers have a requirement to provide a 1-year warranty, builder's warranty on their home. Now, there are separate warranties that builders can pay for that give additional protection. Probably makes it a little bit easier for them as well, not having to go back to certain homes and make repairs, because they buy a third party warranty coverage. But it just says, unless seller's providing an alternate builder's warranty that is under Section 7, we'll pull up Section 7 again just as a reminder, in which the cases Section 11 will not apply. Seller does warrant. They've got to warrant all of these items in as described here. Landscape, sprinklers, plumbing, electrical, the structural elements of the residence. So the seller does, by law, they are obligated to provide that 1-year builder's warranty. So just be mindful of that. If the builder says, no, we don't have one of those, we're not doing that. Well, unless there's some other agreement that buyer and seller have come into, they're going to be obligated to do it. And we go back into Section 7. That's where this is talking about, where let's see here. Yeah, right there, the builder's warranty is part of that. And part of those disclosures, they're supposed to provide what that warranty is going to, in essence, going to cover. So part of the seller's disclosures. Okay. 12, the walkthrough. So this is very similar to our normal walkthroughs that exist on the REPC. However, the majority of you, if not all of you, have probably done a new construction walkthrough before. And that's when you, depending on the builder, how they've set it up, the larger builders, they have a more structured process where you're going to go and you're going to meet with the project manager more than likely, and they'll give you some tape, or your agent will bring some blue tape, and you're going to go through and not only be instructed all of the how to operate things in the house, you're also going to point out things that need to be repaired. And that's typically within a week before you're about to settle. And all of these things that are going to be taped or things that need to be fixed, it gives that project manager a week, a few days before settlement to make all of those repairs. Some of the repairs may require more time than your settlement deadline, and that's where it is specified here. If things are not completed, that these touch-up stuff, then the buyer and seller can agree to withhold money in escrow at settlement. Now, it's important to point out here that even though the contract says that the parties may withhold money in escrow, a reasonable amount as agreed by the seller, buyer and mortgage lender, this is the critical part, the mortgage lenders. The lender oftentimes may not be okay with having money escrowed. They may require that work is completed before they actually sign or have the settlement. And if you're working with the builder's preferred lender, then and the builder's not going to allow money to be escrowed, well, they're going to adjust for that settlement deadline, so it's not going to impact you and your buyer. And they're going to, they'll move the settlement deadline a couple of days apart, whatever's to give the builder time to make those repairs. But if you're using your own, hold on a second. If you're using your own lender and there's a delay, then you may not have the option of getting that extension. Sorry, I think I got a message. I'm trying to find out are there any questions that are in the chat, because I'm not seeing. Okay, nope, there aren't. Sorry about that. I wanted to stop the share screen for a second because I thought I got a message saying that there's a bunch of messages in the chat. So sorry, I'll go back and share that. Does that make sense? So that's one of the advantages, of course, using the preferred lender's lender the builder's lender, is any delays, well, they're not going to transfer those delays onto the buyer. Whereas if you use your own and lender, and I get it, I prefer to use my own lender as well versus using the builder's lender. But we just need to make sure that our client, our buyer, is aware that any changes like that can impact them. So, okay. The paragraph in 12.2, 12.3, and these things, these are pretty standard. Substantial completion. Make sure that you're aware. Substantial completion, if you don't know what that really means, this is when the city will come in and determine if the home is now habitable, if it meets the condition. And this is where they're going to, once the substantial completion is complete, that's when the city will give a certificate of occupancy. So as you can see, when occupancy of the residence is allowable under the rules, ordinances, and laws of the city. Once you have that substantial completion or that certificate of occupancy, that's when the deadline on this contract of substantial completion has been met. And at that point, it's, in fact, I think the contract says in 24 that within 7 days or however many, whenever substantial completion deadline is here, X days after the buyer's receipt written notice of substantial completion. So it's usually within 7 days of getting that notification that the COO is when they're going to typically want to close on the property. Now understand that even once you have the substantial completion means that the home is now able to be occupied, but there still may be some repairs that are cosmetic that need to be done on the home, and the builder is able to do that after they settle. So just the contract even allows that to take place, and hence the reason why you give them that 30-day window to make that happen. Kind of a standard construction access, buyers understanding that this is a construction zone, and the seller is going to put some regulations on what can and can't happen. So many builder contracts say that, hey, the buyer is not able to enter the premises or enter the construction site without either approval from the builder or unless they're being supervised by the builder. So just know that you'll have the right to do some reasonable inspections of the property, but however, the seller reserves the right to limit the inspection and when that's going to happen, so that it doesn't hinder or delay any of the work. So just be mindful of that. The construction compliance, obviously this has to meet the standards of local governments and ordinances and the federal laws. So they're going to be obligated to meet those requirements. Okay, these regulatory changes. This has been coming up a lot lately, is because right now, or at least for the last year and a half, there have been many phone calls that I've had to take where builders have had, well, whether they've had to or not, they've chosen to increase the total purchase price or the agreed upon purchase price because their costs have gone up substantially. And they've just come in and unilaterally said that we're going to increase the price. Early on, most contracts, even the builder contracts, did not give the builder the ability to do that. But as they saw a lot of these problems occurred, they've started modifying their own contracts or adding addenda that gives them the authorization. Well, this part of this contract, it does allow the seller to make to transfer any increase in costs or labor materials to the buyer if it's due to a regulatory change. You're like, well, what does that mean? So say like a city were to impose some type of city ordinance, city law, city change that required every home to either have some new monitoring. Let's say that there's a gas valve that has always been used, and there's now a new gas valve that is far more efficient, far more safe, or whatever it is, but it's twice the cost. And the city comes in and now mandates that gas valve must be used in effective at such date. So any new home, because of that regulatory change in the city, that piece of material, and let's say that the cost to install it is 3 times as long, and that labor increase would then now be able to be transferred onto the buyer. But if it's not caused by a regulatory change, meaning just lumber has gone up, or gas prices because of that, so the cost of delivery, all these other things has gone up. Well, that's not what this part of the contract talks about, and that part technically would not be able to be transferred over to the buyer. So make sure you understand the difference between a regulatory change. If it is that, then those increased in costs, the seller is able to transfer that cost to the buyer. Otherwise, they are not. Any questions about that?
I do, Rob.
Yeah.
How often are we seeing contracts where the builders have the contracts and it's their contract? And it's not just regulatory changes, because I would think if there was an increase in lumber and different things, they are going to want to pass that cost also on. What are we seeing? Is there something that we're seeing right now in that? Are they still passing those costs along and it's in their contract? Do you know?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, over the last year and a half, we have been seeing those. And typically what the contracts used to say is, you know, if there was they didn't really talk about it at all because there was not, there wasn't significant changes in what the builders were dealing with. And so they didn't have them. Well, now the builders are seeing significant changes that's occurred. And so they have started to put in their contracts that'll say if materials or labor were to increase more than 5 to 10%, usually it's 5%, then the builder is obligated to show the increase to the buyer, but that buyer is assuming that increase on their own. And that's one of the scary things about some of these new construction transactions, where the build may take a year. Well, we've already known just in the last 3-4 months what can happen in a short period of time. The rates increasing, materials increasing, the cost increasing overall, labor. And so to project a year from now, what is this house going to cost? You know, there's some risk. And so that's definitely something that you want to make sure that you discuss with your client. But then also if you're meeting with these builders, ask them these questions. Hey, what if materials do increase? Do you have something in your contract that says who's paying for that? And if they say yes, it's going to be the buyer, well, maybe you negotiate that in advance, or at least make your client understand what they're getting into.
Rob, this is Carla Giles. I definitely had that on my last new build. And I, kind of was hesitant to ask, too many times, but I did ask about an increase. And he says, yeah, our normal operation is after we get it framed, then we kind of come together and have our own builders meeting and see what was going to happen. Well, on this build, it didn't happen till a week and a half before closing. My clients, we kept going, we were all secretly going, oh man, okay, no, it's not going to go up. They didn't raise it. Oh, wow, we passed this, and it was great. Nope. Week and a half before, we got suckered with like $23,000 more.
Correct. And what's been happening is the clients are coming to us and say, well, can they do that? And most of the time, the contract does not allow them to do that. And so, of course, you can say, no, we're not going to allow that. We have a contract here, and we want it to be upheld. Now, this is where the builder, many times the builder at that point has said, well, if I don't make these changes, then I'm going to go bankrupt anyway. So I'm not going to sell it to you. So this is if the builder or seller does not have in their contract the right to increase prices, then they've added in their contract that they have the right to cancel the contract for any reason. And if they do exercise that right, the only remedy that the buyer will have is the return of their earnest money and construction deposit. So in those situations, usually, and Carly, tell me if your situation is similar, what was happening is, let's say the initial price to build the home was supposed to be $500,000, and you went under contract 9 months ago, and now if that builder were to sell the property, they could sell it for $550, $575, maybe even $600. And let's say it's $575. And now the builder's costs have gone up, so they're asking the buyer to to make, in Carla's case, $23,000. And so now instead of $500,000 purchase price, it's 523. But the homes, if the buyer were to sell that home himself, they could sell it for either 575 or 600. So the buyer's faced with the scenario, if they don't close on that home, then, and they were to just cancel the deal, not only they're going to lose that $50,000 to $75,000 equity that's in the home. Well, then if they go buy something else, now they're going to have to go buy a home for 600 or 575. So they lose money that way. And it sucks for the buyer, but when you have these conversations with them, it still is probably in their best interest to close on the home and pay the $23,000 increase. Carl, I don't know if yours was similar to that or not.
That was exactly the same situation. That's
Okay.
what they kept pushing. Well, the home is worth this now. The how we can sell it. That's okay. And they literally had it in the contract that the seller could back out
Correct.
at any time. And so that's exactly what they were forced with. And we knew the price of the home had gone up, but the value, the equity, it was exactly the same scenario.
Yeah. Yeah. Unfortunately, like I said, that's only reason why I know this is because I've had so many of these conversations over the last year and a half. I wish I could sit here and say, well, I've never had that happen to explain to me, but it's not the case. So it sucks, no question about it, for the buyer. But the reason why I want to address this is because now you can have this conversation with this buyer up front. Just say, hey, buyer, this is what we've seen. I don't know if that's what's going to happen, but these are the possibilities. So let's make sure that we have these conversations up front with the builders to see what theirs looks like and what we can negotiate up front versus 9 months later, a week and a half before closing, getting hit with something. And even if you have this conversation up front, it still is possible that a week and a half before closing, heck, I know of some that have happened the day of 3 days before closing that it happened, that the price could change, but at least your buyer is prepared for the possibility, and they're not going to look back at you and say, what did I hire you for? You didn't even tell me about this.
Well, and qualifying, can your buyer now qualify for that $23,000
Right.
more?
Yes, that part's huge, and it might be late. It might be that late in the game that they have to resubmit everything through underwriting, and does the home appraise for that amount? I assume it would, but you're right. Can they qualify? Okay.
Bob,
Yes.
I think a lot of times we look at this issue with builders and price changes, or that I think you've hit on. They do it two ways, right? They reserve the right to increase the price, or they reserve the right to cancel. A lot of times I think we look at it and say, well, it's a greedy builder just wanting to back out because 9 months later, this house is worth 18% more than when they first went under contract. But when it comes to the builder having to pay more for materials, that we do have the greedy builder scenario, but we do have builders who are just not that good at business. They're good at building, but not business. And when those prices go up on them, if the builder is upside down in the house and the construction cost, it puts the buyer at risk if they can't get their bills paid, right? So, just for example, let's just say a builder, let's say you go under contract for new construction, it's at 500. And 9 months later, when they're, pouring the last bits of driveway or, whatever, they're doing the finish work. Let's say the cost to build is 520. And that builder comes back and says, hey, we need to increase to 520 or 530 or whatever. If the buyer says no, it's not necessarily a bad thing for that contract to go away, because the builder can't pay off all the liens, all the mechanics liens, and all of the suppliers and subs that have worked on that house. And if they can't do that, it's going to create a big title problem. Because you're not going to be able, your buyer's not going to be able to get all of the lien waivers to clear title. And so, I think some of the time we think of it, greedy builders just want to like build for X and sell for Y. But again, there's a lot of builders who aren't that good at business, and they're actually upside down when they get 9 months down the road and have to either increase the price or cancel. And it's not necessarily, like I said, in your buyer's against your buyer's best interest to let that cancel or to pay more, because it won't clear title because they can't get the lien waivers because the builder can't afford to build the house at that cost. That makes sense.
It does, and thank you for bringing that up on the title side and the issues that you're going to have on title, because that part hasn't come up where I've had in conversations, but what has come up is when I've attended meetings where we've had the builder on one side of the table and the buyer on the other, and the builder is saying, look, here's the proof to show that I will have to pay you in essence to close at the price that we had. All I'm trying to do is break even at this point, and that $30,000 increase is my break even. And if we don't do this, I will ultimately end up having to file bankruptcy anyway. So it is, you're right. They might be incredible builders at construction, but they're bad at the business side of building. And so that's what's caused some problems. So thanks, Sam. Any other questions about that so far? Okay. When we get into, as we carry on, mediation, I've had to attend some mediations with builders and clients about this. And it's important to know that, if the contract says that it shall, well, they've got to mediate before they take any other potential ways to litigate or go to court. But the one thing about mediation, to understand, as I point out here, mediation is only binding if the parties come to an agreement. Just because the parties mediate does not mean that the mediator is able to then unilaterally bind one party or both parties based on what they said. They have to come to a mutual agreement in order for whatever was agreed upon to be binding. Okay. I put in under section 17, I highlighted just the seller default specifically because we go back in here in parts of the contract under specifically dealing with the construction deposit and when that is due. The construction deposit, as we talked about last week, this is due at the pre-construction meeting. And after that pre-construction meeting, that deposit becomes non-refundable unless, as this last line, unless the seller fails to close the transaction in accordance with the terms of the REPC. In such events, the remedies in section 17.2 shall apply, which is talking about seller default. So just know that that's where the contract is linking itself with each other. So, okay, we go down to these are the same paragraphs that are in the REPC. As a reminder, under notices, this is still something we deal with every single day, where agents are canceling a transaction and they send a text to the other side, or they send an email to the other side that their client has decided to cancel. Because in section 8, let's see, it says it here as well. Buyer's right to cancel Buyer shall have the right to cancel the contract or waive any due diligence conditions below. If buyer's sole discretion determines the results of the due diligence are unacceptable, buyer may either no later than the due diligence referenced in section cancel the REPC by providing written notice. Okay, so because that's what it says in section 8, many people forget and they think that a text and or email satisfies the contract, which is true under section 8. You need to provide written notice, but under notices of the contract in section 19 here, it breaks it up even more. There are 3 things that have to happen. A, it's got to be in writing, which a text and email would satisfy. However, it's also got to be B, signed by the buyer or seller giving notice. And then C, it's got to be received by the buyer or seller or the respective agent or their brokerage who's representing the other party, no later than that applicable deadline. So when our staff has asked you to provide proof that you delivered that cancellation before the deadline, that's the reason why we're asking for this, is because this is what makes that requirement fulfilled. It's got to be in writing, it's got to be signed by the buyer or seller giving the notice, and it's got to be received by the other party or the representative before that applicable deadline in order to protect your earnest money. In this case, your earnest money or construction deposit. Any questions about that? Okay. This is an interesting point. Under insurance, values have increased. I am pretty sure you guys have recognized that. So, when this contract was written, having $1 million insurance policy, that the seller's maintaining this stuff during, let's just read it. During the period of construction and until closing, the seller shall maintain in full force and effect at the seller's expense a builder's risk insurance policy for the full replacement value of all completed portions and improvements, including the residence, and all construction materials located on site, workman's compensation insurance in accordance with Utah law, and public general liability insurance in the amount not less than $1 million or whatever. Well, many times this contract might be used and the buyer is actually getting the construction loan under their name, and then the builder's having to take draws on it and stuff like that. Well, right here is the builder, when they go take this construction loan and they put all this lumber on the property, and now they show up the next day and it's been stolen. Who's responsible for that? Well, in this part, it's saying the seller is going to be responsible for an insurance policy. So make sure that A, they've got one, and B, that it's enough to cover the cost of the home that's being built. Homes have increased, so just make sure that you got that taken care of. Okay, these things are basically the same. So, tail
Question
end.
real quick.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the number, the $1 million, that should be just your home price, right?
Should not. Typically, that would not include the land value. It's
So the
just
building price.
the building material. That's correct.
Okay, awesome.
And the insurance won't typically insure the land anyway. It's usually just the structure on the land.
So how does that work then? Say that, I'm buying a new build for exactly $1 million. Do they just account on like a quarter acre of property? Will they just go in and account for like building price at that point, or how does that work?
Well, you're going to have two things. So, I mean, yes, if you're going to go buy a home and it's valued at $1 million, but
that's land too.
it's
Building and land.
factoring the land. I mean, there's a good chance if that were the case, the land is probably 40%, at least 30 to 40% of the total price. So in that event, if the land is worth 300, 400, well, it's probably pretty safe then. The $1 million policy would be just fine. But if if you're building, it should be.
If you're looking at like a multi-million-dollar build job, before you write the offer, I would contact an insurance provider and have them guide you, because you have the $1 million default, but then you have the next box, which is blank. And if you're doing, say, like a $3 million custom build, and 2 million of it is the actual construction materials and things like that, then you'd want to sit down with an insurance person and say, okay, how much should we be insuring this for before you fill out the offer?
Sam and Rob, what about that? They included workman's compensation insurance. Is that separate than this 1 million, or is that including that workman's compensation there?
I believe it's part of their insurance policy that they would be required to get. Well, actually, sorry, they're going to have their own workman's comp that they're going to have, and that would be separate from this actual policy. Is that correct, Sam?
Yeah, so this is talking about a bunch of different policies, which are not going to be the same policy. Workman's comp is a separate policy, right? Public general liability is a separate policy. The builder's risk is a separate policy. And so if you're provided with just a copy of workers' compensation proof of insurance, and let's just say you're on you're representing a buyer in a new build, and the builder only gives you a proof of workers' comp. Well, that's not enough, because under this contract, they've got to have public general liability and builder's risk as well. And so you would want proof of those insurances as well as workers' comp. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you. So that $1 million or whatever is not including these other things. We just want to make sure that they have all of those different policies.
Yeah. Yep.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sam. So tailing off on deadlines. So Sam and I, we were talking about this, that the seller disclosure deadline and the substantial completion deadline, those are pretty much, you're going to have to talk with the builder as to what's available. I mean, do they need a week on the seller disclosure deadline? Do they have it right when you write the contract? Who knows? But substantial completion deadline, they're going to say we're 3-4 months before we can even get approval from the city, and once we get approval from the city, we're 120 or 150 days out from that deadline. So okay, we can put in this section 150 days after approval from the city. What I don't want is in any of these dates is TBD, to be determined. Now we don't want to do that, because when people put TBD, it prevents anybody from being able, there's no end in sight. And I've seen these contracts where something like that is put, and you've got buyer or seller at their hands are tied. At least when you've got some type of thing in place. I mean, heck, even if you were to ask the builder, is there any chance that this is going to take longer than a year for substantial completion? No, we should max 9-10 months. They may say, yeah, 15 months or a year is possible, but no longer than 15 months. Okay, well then, if worst case scenario, put 15 months out there, but don't do to be determined. The next part talks about B, C, and D. So I just put on here that because these dates, things need to happen. And I almost almost wish the pre-construction meeting deadline was they had that as listed as B instead of due diligence. Because I believe that one of two things need to happen. And Sam agreed. Either I want to have that pre-construction meeting before, if possible, before that due diligence deadline, but at least those deadlines should be the same. Because I want to have, and before if you remember, before the pre-construction meeting, you were supposed to meet with the builder and go over the plans. So prior to the pre-construction meeting, buyer and seller shall meet and review the plans and specifications, because you want to know what that is going into the house. And so you want to know that before your due diligence deadline, because that's when your earnest money and construction deposit end up being due. So at a bare minimum, if you can get the pre-construction meeting, have that deadline before the due diligence deadline, then great. But at least put those deadlines the same, in our opinion. And you're going to definitely have to discuss with the builder and maybe even the lender with all these dates, how long they anticipate the construction is going to take. So the construction loan as well. This should be, I should have added, after the due diligence pre-construction meeting, but you also need to ask the lender and builder when they think that they're going to be able to start getting the funding for that construction loan. Because once this deadline is passed, that's when the last opportunity to protect your earnest money and your construction deposit. Because if you fail to get the construction loan, then 4 days after that deadline, as defined here, failure to obtain the construction loan. So 4 days after the construction loan funding deadline, whereupon the earnest money deposit and construction loan, if applicable, shall be released to the buyer. That's the last opportunity for your buyer to be able to protect their earnest money and their construction deposit. So you want to have a conversation with the builder and the lender to find out what is that deadline. And if you're approaching that deadline, it doesn't appear it's going to happen, then make sure that you're modifying these dates if necessary. Okay. Any questions about this? What we've gone over? This is, it's a document that you may not see as often, and so it's easy to forget certain things, but you need to make sure that you're aware of it. Any questions about that while we're ending?
I have a question. How many people are actually seeing new builders using this document anymore? My experience has been they typically have their own contracts now.
You're primarily correct, Jeanette. Is most of them have gone that route. They paid an attorney and got their own document, but we still see I still see that regularly that it's being used. So
the one thing I like about it is we can kind of use this as a basis to maybe try to negotiate the builder's contract. We can kind of use this information too.
Yeah, I mean, there's twofold. This particular contract is, if you want to say, a little bit more fair for both the buyer and seller, versus a builder's contract. I don't even have to read one to assume that it's going to be favorable to the seller only. And so just when we have those conversations with our client, make sure that they're aware of it, that more than likely this is going to be in the seller's favor versus this contract is more of an equal playing field. Okay. Any other questions about that?
Rob, this is Julie Newey. I just want to make a comment from personal experience, unfortunately, and of hearing stories. Just make sure that your buyer understands that these draws that this builder is going to take, right? That is, you've got that in writing. Who has the privilege of okaying that? Because sometimes if you don't have that in writing, that they've got to get permission from you first, you can really get in big trouble And we experienced that back in 2008. It was not a pleasant experience. And when everything crashed. And so we were just kind of trusting. And I think that's a big thing to bring up with your buyer and their lender.
It's a great point, Julie. So what, if you guys don't understand what she's talking about, when you're getting a construction loan, let's just say it's it's a $500,000 loan. Well, the bank doesn't just turn over $500,000 to the builder. The builder does it in stages, and usually it's 3 or 4 draws total that's going to happen. The first draw is to get the footings, get the I don't even want to assume what they're in stages, but it's going to come. The first part might be for the footings, might for the fees. The first part of purchasing the second stage is usually where the lumber they're going to come in. That might be a little bit bigger, and they're going to have the lumber, the more of the materials that are to come out. But no matter how the stages are broken up, they break it up in stages so that the builder needs to provide proof that the money is being used as it was intended to, versus just giving this lump sum of money and trust that they're going to use it appropriately. So thanks, Julie.
I have one more question. It's kind of off the wall, but so I worked with the builder in the past, and it wasn't a very good experience. And I know other people I've worked with, and it was kind of horrible. But he is actually getting his real estate license now. And can he be the real estate agent for his own construction?
From the licensure side, I don't believe there is. I believe the answer would be yes. From a license perspective, they would just have to disclose it. They can't do their own the loan, and you can't be the agent and do the lending side. But
you can be the builder
and selling their own product, they certainly be no different if you and I are selling our own home.
Right. Okay.
Now the difference would be they wouldn't be able to represent a buyer. So that's the reason why they typically don't represent themselves. They may have their own.
So he wouldn't be able to represent the buyer. So if he's not willing to pay the buyer's agent, then, and somebody wants to build with him, then they'd have to pay their own agent.
That is correct. And that happens all the time, where you get that buyer broker agreement signed. That's where the obligation the buyer has to pay your fee if the builder or the seller is unwilling to pay for it.
Right. Okay.
Okay.
Rob,
Yeah.
I've got just something to throw out there too, is on this builder that I had, he offered the buyers, incentives if they use their title company, there was a couple other things. Those incentives came out of my commission. So just be aware, it's in the fine print, but I didn't catch it on the first time around.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that. That is definitely more unique. Usually the builder incentives that are being offered comes out of either the lender's pocket or the builder's pocket. I haven't seen it very often where they're transferring that over to the agent. But again, read these contracts.
It happened.
read these contracts, because you're right. If they could easily put that language there, and if we're not reading this stuff, then it certainly could come back to bite us. Okay. Well, appreciate everybody's participation in this. Hopefully this has been helpful. And Sam, I appreciate your words as well. That's very helpful. But we'll go ahead and call it quits at that point. Want to wish everybody a happy Tuesday, and we will talk to you later.
Thanks, Rob.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rob.
Bye-bye.